Millionaire invites his cleaner to humiliate her, but she arrives like a queen. She was judged before she even said a word. A man of wealth thought he could define her worth with a single invitation, but what he didn't know was that her presence alone would change the entire room. Sometimes, one quiet step into a place you were never meant to be is the first move toward rewriting your story forever. Can prejudice blind us to someone's real worth? What would you do if you'd been underestimated your whole life? And when the moment finally came to stand tall, would you take it? You ever have one of those mornings where you just keep your head down and tell yourself, just get through the day? That was me, Tuesday, 6:15 a.m., in the front foyer of Rick Callahan's place, kneeling on the marble, trying to buff out a streak that wouldn't quit. The house smelled like lemon polish and fresh coffee I'd brewed for him, though I knew I wouldn't get a cup myself. Outside, the sound of a landscaper's leaf blower buzzed through the open windows. Inside, Rick's voice cut through the air like a cold wind. He was on the phone, striding back and forth in a tailored navy suit, talking about his annual charity gala like it was the Oscars. 200 guests. No exceptions. If you can't tell they're worth at least 7 figures by looking at them, cross them off, he said into his Bluetooth, barely missing a beat as he stepped around me like I was part of the rug. Paige, his assistant, trailed behind him with a clipboard, scribbling like her life depended on it. Then Rick stopped mid-stride, turned, and looked straight at me for the first time all morning. The corner of his mouth tilted not a smile, more like the way you look at a puzzle piece you're not sure fits. "Claire," he said, loud enough for Paige to look up, "you should come to the gala this year. As a guest." The word sat heavy in the air. Paige's eyes flickered toward me, then back down to her clipboard. I felt the sting before I even had time to answer. "I'll have something sent over. Something appropriate." He didn't wait for a yes or no, just turned back to Paige and kept walking, tossing over his shoulder, "Make sure she's not late." Can't have the help wandering in after the salad course. I swallowed whatever I was going to say, the way you swallow aspirin without water quick, rough, hoping it goes down without choking you. Funny thing is, this wasn't even the first time he'd thrown me into a room just to watch me squirm. Last Christmas, he'd made me serve eggnog in front of a table of developers and forgotten to introduce me. But this felt different. There was something calculated in his tone, like he already had the punchline and I was the joke. I figured I'd just add it to the list of things I'd never say out loud. Keep my head down, do the work, drive home. That was the plan. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have known, was that somewhere between now and the gala, everything was about to flip on its head. And this time, I wouldn't be the one standing there, small and silent. After Rick's voice disappeared down the hall, I bent to pick up the laundry basket from the mudroom. The dryer sheet still clung to one of the pillowcases, warm and smelling like lavender detergent, the kind I'd never buy for myself because it costs twice as much at the Willow Creek Market. The back staircase creaked under my feet as I climbed. His words kept looping in my head. As a guest. Something appropriate. I'd worked for enough people like Rick to know the difference between kindness and bait. This was bait. And I wasn't sure yet if he planned to reel me in slowly or yank the line hard. In a place like Willow Creek, cruelty rarely looks like yelling. It's a look that lingers too long on your thrift store sweater. It's a joke about whether you have to work overtime to afford a ticket to the PTA spaghetti dinner. It's the way someone at church will smile at you during the sermon, but turn away at the bake sale table. I'd gotten good at swallowing those moments, the way you swallow a pill without water fast, so it doesn't stick. But I wasn't who they thought I was. To them, I was the woman in the back pew at church, the one who showed up to town council meetings only when the agenda had something to do with school lunches, the one who stood at the edge of the crowd at the 4th of July picnic, holding a paper plate and keeping to herself. What they didn't see, what they couldn't imagine, was that I'd once run Donovan Apparel, a fashion label worn on red carpets and featured in Vogue. We had a showroom in New York and buyers from Los Angeles to London. I knew what it was like to walk into a hotel ballroom in Milan and have people stand to greet me. And then, in what felt like one long bad dream, it was gone. Michael, my husband, put everything we had into a tech startup, a friend swore was going to change the way America connects. 6 months later, the company folded. Bankruptcy court doesn't care about your brand history or the fact that you once made a gown for a first lady. The foreclosure notice on our house came in the same week as the auction order for our cars. When Michael died of a heart attack 3 months later, I had a 10-year-old son, Noah, and more debt than I could calculate without crying. Willow Creek wasn't home. It was where I found the only job that would keep a roof over our heads scrubbing floors in a house bigger than any hotel suite I'd ever stayed in. That afternoon, I was in Rick's library. The air had that mix of old paper, leather bindings, and faint cigar smoke that clings no matter how much you polish. A glass of bourbon, half empty, sat on the desk beside a yellow legal pad filled with Rick's tight slanted handwriting deal numbers, land plot codes, phone numbers I recognized from local real estate listings. As I dusted the coffee table, a heavy book, America's Great Political Moments, shifted under my cloth. Something slipped out and fluttered to the rug. I bent down to pick it up. It was a photograph. Me 10 years younger, in a deep emerald gown that caught the light just so shaking hands with Senator Whitfield at a charity gala in Chicago. Behind us, flashbulbs went off like fireworks. My smile was confident, polished, practiced. The caption printed beneath in crisp type read, Claire Donovan, CEO of Donovan Apparel. For a second, I didn't breathe. The paper bent slightly in my fingers. I remembered that night, the weight of the gown, the champagne glass in my hand, the sound of a jazz trio playing in the corner. I'd made a toast that night that ended up in the Chicago Tribune. Back then, if I wanted to speak to a senator, I picked up the phone. Now, I stood in this library with dust on my sleeves, holding that memory like it might dissolve if I gripped it too hard. I slid the photo back between the pages, but I didn't forget where I put it. That evening, while folding Rick's monogrammed shirts in the laundry room, the memory kept creeping back. Not the glamour, not the money, but the woman I'd been. The one who walked into a room with her chin lifted and her eyes steady. And as I stacked the shirts, I caught myself wondering something I hadn't in years. What would she do, that woman in the emerald gown, if she were here now? For the next 2 days, I went about my work like nothing had shifted. Morning coffee brewed and set on Rick's kitchen island before he came downstairs. His shirts pressed crisp, no hint of starch burn. Fresh lilies arranged for the foyer, their scent mingling with lemon polish. Even took his tuxedo measurements for Saturday's gala. Him standing in the middle of the study, arms out like a man getting fitted for armor. "Don't make it too snug," he said, smirking at his own reflection in the French doors. I just nodded, pen scratching the numbers on my pad. It was easier to play it steady. No one suspects a storm if the water looks calm. But at night, in my small apartment above Main Street, the one wedged between Earl's Barber Shop and the Willow Creek Diner, the quiet was mine. I'd sit at the little oak table my dad built years ago, pull out a spiral-bound notebook, and start making my list. Every name I could think of who might be at that gala went down in ink. Senators, CEOs, charity heads, people whose business cards I still had tucked into an old jewelry box. Next to each name, I jotted notes, the charity auction where I'd met them, the marketing campaign we'd collaborated on, even small jokes we'd once shared over bad hotel coffee. It was almost eerie how easily it came back. Those rooms, those conversations, they weren't gone. They'd just been sealed off, like a part of me was in storage waiting for the right key. I didn't have the wardrobe for that world anymore. Saks and Neiman Marcus had been replaced by the clearance racks at Kohl's. But there was one person I knew could help me bridge that gap: Evelyn Harper. Evelyn had been my secret weapon during the Donovan Apparel days, the seamstress who could take a dress from beautiful to unforgettable with one evening of work. She'd sewn gowns for mayors, wives, and television anchors, never bragging, just tucking her pins into a tomato cushion and humming Patsy Cline while she worked. She'd retired a few years back, moved into a little ranch-style house near the train station. Her garage had been turned into a sewing room. I'd seen it once, bolts of fabric stacked to the ceiling, 2 Singer machines side by side like sentinels. It was just after dusk when I knocked on her door. The porch light flickered twice before holding steady, and then Evelyn herself appeared. Still tall, silver hair swept into a bun, reading glasses pushed up on her head. "Claire Donovan?" she said, her voice almost catching. Her hands flew to her mouth. Lord have mercy, child. I thought I'd lost you. The hug was instant, strong. For a moment, I just let it happen. Let someone hold me like I wasn't a problem to be solved. She ushered me inside, poured sweet tea into mason jars, and we sat at her kitchen table surrounded by the faint scent of cinnamon. I told her everything. Not about humiliation, because that wasn't the whole truth, but about opportunity. About the faces I knew would be at that gala, the conversations that could happen if I walked in ready, on my own terms. Evelyn didn't interrupt, didn't pity me, just listened, her hand resting on the table, fingers tapping lightly like she was already working something out. Then she stood. Wait here. I could hear her moving through the garage, the rustle of fabric, the metallic clink of hangers sliding on a rack. When she came back, she carried a garment bag in both hands like it was something sacred. She laid it across the couch and unzipped it slowly. Midnight blue, she said. Timeless. Made it for a client 2 years ago who never came back to claim it. Thought about selling it, but something told me to keep it. The dress was simple in the way the best things are. Clean lines, fabric that caught the light without screaming for it. Try it on, she said, and there was no question mark in her voice. I stepped into the sewing room, slipped off my jeans and sweater, and eased the gown over my head. It slid into place like it remembered me. The hem skimmed the floor. The waist sat exactly where it should. When I came back into the kitchen, Evelyn's smile was quiet but proud. Fits like it was made for you, she said. And maybe it was. I stood there, looking at myself in the full-length mirror she'd propped against the wall. I wasn't just seeing the dress. I was seeing a flicker of that other life, the way I carried myself back then. Evelyn must have seen it too, because she said, whatever you're planning to do at that gala, you're going to do it well. I didn't tell her everything. Not yet. But I knew she'd just handed me the first real tool I'd had in years. And as I folded the dress back into the garment bag, I thought, Rick Callahan has no idea what's coming. The Callahan estate sat on the edge of Willow Lake like it owned the shoreline. Every window lit, its reflection shimmering on the dark water. From the long gravel driveway, you could already hear the low hum of conversation and the clink of glass against glass. Spotlights swept across the sky like a movie premiere, announcing to the whole town that tonight, Rick Callahan was the center of gravity. Inside, the house was unrecognizable. Chandeliers dripped light onto polished floors, and the air smelled faintly of champagne and roses. A string quartet played near the grand staircase, their bows moving in perfect unison, filling the space with the kind of music you only hear at fundraisers and weddings with open bars. Guests were everywhere, leaning against marble columns, clustering near the catering stations, already calculating which conversations were worth their time. Willow Creek's power players had shown up in force. The mayor with his wife in a gold sequined dress. The school board president still wearing his community picnic name badge like a title of honor. 3 city council members laughing too loudly at a developer's joke. Rick was in his element. He moved through the room like a man campaigning for an office no one had announced yet, shaking hands, dropping names, tossing out quick jokes that made people laugh just enough to feel like they'd shared a moment. Every few minutes, his eyes flicked toward the front door. He was waiting for me. From across the room, you could see the small-town politics at play. Mrs. Leland, who ran the Willow Creek Historical Society, had positioned herself beside the buffet table, prime territory to catch the ear of anyone with deep pockets. At the far end, the owner of the hardware store was cornering a bank manager about a zoning permit for his new location. You could feel it in the air. Everyone was there for the show, but also for the deals that could be made in the shadow of the string quartet. Rick thrived on this unspoken barter system. Tonight wasn't just about charity. It was about who owed him after this, who he could call on when he needed a favor passed quietly through the town council. The servers moved like clockwork, trays balanced on one hand, offering canapes with the other. I recognized 2 of them. Kids from the high school where I volunteered once a month for the business mentorship program. They gave me small nods as they passed, their eyes scanning the room in the same way I once did, learning how the upper crust moved, who carried themselves like they expected the best seat in the house. Rick caught sight of the police chief, clapped him on the shoulder like they were old buddies, then slipped a folded check into his breast pocket with a grin that said, "We both know you'll remember this later." It was the same grin he'd given me in the foyer 3 days ago when he invited me. I could imagine the story he'd planned. The moment I walked in, awkward, underdressed, and he'd sweep over to introduce me to someone I'd never afford to speak to otherwise. A joke here, a sly comment there. Enough for people to smirk into their champagne. He wanted me to be the evening's quiet punchline. But what he didn't know was that I wasn't coming alone. In the shadows near the entrance, a young event photographer shifted her camera strap nervously. I'd met her the week before at the PTA bake sale. Her daughter was in Noah's science class. When she saw me, she smiled knowingly. I'd asked her for just one favor: make sure to get the shot. She didn't know what I meant yet, but she would. Near the bar, Evelyn Harper had arrived early, wearing a simple black dress and a pearl necklace that had probably been in her family for generations. She caught my eye and gave the tiniest nod, like a seamstress might before sending a model down the runway. Rick checked his watch, smoothed his tuxedo jacket, and positioned himself near the center of the room with the grand staircase as his backdrop. He was ready for his big moment. The double doors at the entrance swung open, and for just a second, even the string quartet seemed to play a little softer. Then the double doors opened. Conversations stuttered. Claire entered, the midnight blue gown catching the light, her hair in a low chignon, diamond studs catching a glint from the chandeliers. She wasn't flashy, she was effortless. Rick's smirk faltered. From across the room, Senator Whitfield blinked, then smiled broadly. "Claire Donovan?" My God, it's been too long. Heads turned. The president of a Chicago venture capital firm hurried over. "Claire, we thought you'd left the country." Rick's laughter died in his throat as the circle around Claire grew, each handshake and embrace another nail in the coffin of his plan. By the time dinner was served, the plan Rick had rehearsed in his head for days was already coming apart. The ballroom, or what passed for one, in his sprawling lakeside home, buzzed with that post-cocktail hour hum. Voices overlapping, silverware clinking against china, the occasional ripple of laughter from one table that made another table turn to see what they'd missed. Rick had expected me to be tucked somewhere in the middle, maybe at a table with the Rotary Club donors, who were too polite to make a scene, but not influential enough to matter. But when the seating cards were placed, I was at the head table. Not because Rick wanted me there, but because Senator Whitfield had spotted me in the crowd during the reception and called out, loud enough for half the room to hear, "Claire Donovan?" Well, if it isn't the best-dressed surprise of the evening. "You're sitting with me." It was the same voice he'd used at campaign rallies, the one that could cut through a marching band. Chairs were shifted, place cards discreetly swapped, and before Rick could protest, I was settling into the seat between the senator and a tech CEO whose company had just gone public. The tablecloth was crisp white linen, the kind you could hear when you smoothed it under your fingers. Dinner was plated in perfect symmetry. Wild-caught salmon over a bed of wild rice, asparagus spears arranged like compass points. The senator opened with, "You still keeping up with the renewable energy sector, Claire?" I smiled. "Trying, though it's hard to keep pace with how quickly it's moving." I asked the CEO about his recent acquisition, then linked it to a conversation I'd had years ago with one of his former investors. Before long, we were talking about tax incentives for solar manufacturing in mid-sized towns, the kind of towns people usually forget about until election season. On my other side, a philanthropist I'd once met at a Chicago fundraiser leaned in. "Do you remember that art auction? The one where the mayor's wife kept outbidding everyone?" I laughed, and the sound surprised me. Not polite, not cautious, but genuine. I remember the look on the mayor's face when he realized she'd just bought a sculpture too big for their front hallway. The conversation flowed the way it used to, each story opening a door to another. I didn't have to prove I belonged. I just belonged. Across the table, two investors I'd never met before were taking notes. Actual notes, while I gave a quick 2-minute breakdown of current fashion market trends. I told them how mid-range luxury was poised for a resurgence, how consumers were hungry for brands that combined quality with sustainability, and how the market was shifting in ways that reminded me of the years right before Donovan Apparel's first breakout line. They didn't look away once. Rick, seated 3 chairs down, barely touched his food. He'd spear a bite of salmon, move it halfway to his mouth, then set the fork down again. Every time he glanced toward me, his expression tightened just enough for me to catch it. He had wanted a scene, a stumble, an awkward pause, a moment that would make people smirk into their wine glasses. Instead, I was holding the room without raising my voice. The funny thing about small-town politics is that even in a room full of outsiders, the locals are watching. At the far end of the table, I caught the school board president leaning toward the mayor, whispering something while looking my way. Not in that polite, "Oh, isn't she doing well way?" More in the par, "How the hell did we miss this way?" There's a certain electricity in realizing you've shifted the balance without even meaning to. The kind you feel at a company picnic when the quietest guy in accounting suddenly wins the 3-legged race and everyone has to recalibrate who they thought he was. I could feel the shift happening around me. Conversations at nearby tables grew quieter, not because the music had stopped, but because people were leaning to hear what was being said at ours. Midway through the entree, Senator Whitfield stood to toast the evening. To the generosity of Willow Creek, he said, "Glass raised," and to the remarkable people who remind us that the measure of someone's worth isn't what they have, but what they've built. He didn't look at Rick when he said it. He looked at me. The photographer I'd spoken to earlier slipped behind a potted palm to get the shot. The senator raising his glass toward me meeting his gaze with a small, steady smile. Rick's fork scraped lightly against his plate, the sound barely audible over the applause. But I heard it. And as the toasts faded and dessert menus were passed, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever story Rick had planned for tonight, I had just rewritten the ending. The gala had wound down to its final stragglers. The quartet had packed up their instruments, and the last of the champagne flutes clinked faintly in the catering bins. Through the arched windows, the moonlight over Willow Lake looked colder than it had when the night began. I slipped into the coat room just off the main hall, where rows of wool and cashmere hung heavy on brass racks. The scent of cedar sachets mixed with the faint perfume left behind by guests. My wrap. A soft, well-worn piece Evelyn had pressed earlier in the week was draped neatly over a hanger. I was fastening it around my shoulders when I heard the door click shut behind me. Rick stood there, hands in his pockets, tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, bow tie hanging loose around his neck. His eyes didn't have the same glossy confidence they'd carried all night. "You could have told me," he said quietly. I turned, my fingers still working the clasp of the wrap. "Told you what?" He stepped closer, but not too close. Like a man approaching a campfire he wasn't sure he could control. "Who you really are." The way he said it, you'd think I was a spy who'd been living under his roof. I met his gaze, steady. "I'm the same woman who cleans your kitchen. You just didn't bother to look past the apron." For a long moment, he didn't move, didn't speak. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear the faint clatter of trays being stacked, the murmur of the catering crew talking about whose truck had to be jump-started before they could leave. Rick swallowed, and for the first time since I'd known him, he didn't have a comeback. His eyes flickered. Not in the way people do when they're looking for an angle, but in the way someone does when they're trying to replay the past with new information. It reminded me of the way small-town folks look at each other after a council meeting when a vote doesn't go the way they expected. That mix of surprise and recalculation, the slow realization that they might have underestimated someone who now has leverage. "You made me look like a fool tonight," he said finally. But there wasn't much bite in it. "I didn't make you do anything," I replied. "You wrote the script, Rick. I just didn't play the part you had in mind." He shifted his weight, like the ground beneath him wasn't quite steady. "You know, people will be talking. They'll wonder why you're working for me at all." I tightened the wrap around my shoulders, letting the silence hang just long enough for him to feel it. Let them wonder. Maybe they'll think twice before they decide what someone's worth based on the job they do. Rick's jaw moved like he was about to say something else, but nothing came out. That, more than anything, told me this moment had landed deeper than he wanted to admit. In the hallway beyond, the mayor's wife laughed softly at something the police chief said. Their voices faded toward the front door, the click of her heels, a reminder that this night was over for everyone else. But not for Rick. As I reached for the doorknob, I caught his reflection in the mirror above the coat rack. He wasn't watching me leave like a man dismissing someone. He was watching like someone trying to figure out how he'd missed what was in front of him all along. "You're not the person I thought you were," he said to my back. I opened the door. "That's the problem, Rick. You never thought about who I was in the first place." And then I stepped out into the cooler air of the hallway where the last few guests were gathering their coats. My heels clicked softly against the hardwood, each step carrying me farther from the version of myself he'd imagined and closer to the version I'd been waiting to reclaim. Somewhere deep down, I knew this wasn't the last conversation Rick and I would have. Small towns don't let moments like this fade quietly. People talk, stories spread, through whispers at the church potluck, sideways glances at the farmer's market, casual mentions in line at the post office. And the story they'd tell after tonight wasn't the one Rick had planned. 2 days after the gala, Willow Creek had already started humming with its usual Monday rhythm, coffee brewing at the diner by 6 a.m., Mr. Kessler opening the hardware store with the same key he'd used for 40 years, and the faint echo of high school marching band practice drifting from the football field. Inside the Callahan estate, the energy was different. I was in the music room, dusting the glossy black surface of the grand piano. Rick rarely touched it. It was more for show than music, but it got cleaned twice a week just the same. As I polished along the edge, the muffled rumble of male voices floated from Rick's office down the hall. I wasn't trying to listen, but some voices carry, and Matthew Briggs was one of them. Low, steady, with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing you can make or break a man's future with a single sentence. "I'm telling you, Callahan," Briggs said, his voice clear, even through the half-shut door. "If Claire Donovan's available, she's the one you want. Forget this expansion nonsense until you talk to her." The dust cloth stilled in my hand. Matthew Briggs wasn't just one of Rick's investors. He was the investor. The man whose signature on a check could greenlight a waterfront development or sink it before the first permit was filed. Around town, his name carried the kind of weight that could stop a zoning board argument in its tracks. Rick's reply was lower, almost reluctant. "She's been working here for years." Briggs chuckled, and I could picture him leaning back in one of Rick's leather chairs, grinning like he'd just discovered a winning lottery ticket in his jacket pocket. "Then you've been sitting on a gold mine, my friend." There was a pause. That kind of pause that doesn't happen when people agree with each other. In small towns like ours, I'd seen this play out before. At PTA meetings, you could watch the shift in a second, when someone realizes the person they'd written off actually holds the vote they need. At the community board, it's the moment someone speaks up with a fact no one else knew, and suddenly the room tilts toward them. When the meeting ended, I heard the scrape of chairs, like the creak of the office door, and then Matthew Briggs appeared in the hallway. He was taller than I remembered from the few charity events we'd both attended years ago, but the handshake was exactly the same. Firm, warm, deliberate. "Claire," he said, taking my hand like we were old friends. "I don't know how you've been hiding in this place, but I'd like to talk business sometime." It wasn't a casual offer. The way he held my gaze, it was an invitation. And in his world, those didn't get handed out lightly. I smiled, professional but warm. "I'd like that, Mr. Briggs." "Matthew," he corrected with a grin before heading toward the front door. As he left, I could feel the shift, like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples outward, and I knew those ripples were going to hit more than just Rick. When I turned back toward the music room, I caught sight of Rick in the doorway of his office. He wasn't leaning against the frame or wearing that easy smirk he used at the gala. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes tracked every step I took. He didn't say a word. Not then. But I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the same way they did at town council meetings when someone unexpectedly voted down his proposal. That quiet recalculation. The recognition that the game board had changed, and the piece he thought was a pawn might just be holding a queen's move. As I picked up the dust cloth again, the air in the hallway seemed different. Not tense exactly, but charged, like before a summer storm. Somewhere outside, the mail truck rattled past, heading for Main Street. In a town like Willow Creek, word traveled faster than any postal route. By tomorrow, half the people who'd been at that gala would know Matthew Briggs had called me by name. And by the end of the week, the other half would have heard some version of it over pie at the diner or whispered between pews at Sunday service. The thing about ripples? They don't stop until they hit every shore. By Thursday, the weather had turned. A soft drizzle hanging over Willow Creek, the kind that made Main Street smell like wet pavement and coffee from the diner. The Callahan estate was quieter than usual that morning. No contractors hammering on the guest house roof, no deliveries rumbling up the drive, just the low hum of the refrigerator and the sound of rain tapping the kitchen windows. I was wiping down the marble counter, watching the streaks disappear under my cloth, when I heard the deliberate echo of shoes on tile. Rick never came into the kitchen unless he wanted something. He stopped just inside the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who'd practiced his lines, but wasn't sure which order to say them in. "I want you to come on board at Callahan Properties," he said finally. "Senior consultant. 6 figures." He said it the way people drop a trump card in a poker game. Sure, it'll clear the table. I kept polishing. Would you have offered me that if no one knew who I was? The question hung there, the way a single pointed comment can stop a whole conversation at a PTA meeting. Rick shifted his weight like he was buying time. "I'm offering now." I set the cloth down and faced him fully. "Then you're not hiring me for my skills, Rick. You're hiring me to keep others from hiring me." That landed. I could see it in the flicker behind his eyes. He was used to negotiating property deals, zoning variances, even whisper campaigns at the country club. But this wasn't about a building permit or a buyout. This was about control. "And I don't work under those terms," I said, my voice steady. For a moment, neither of us moved. Somewhere outside, the rain thickened, drumming against the gutters. The sound filled the space between us, but it didn't make it less sharp. His refusal to respond right away told me everything. In small towns like ours, silence can be as loud as any argument. I'd seen the same kind of pause at community board meetings, when someone realizes the vote they counted on isn't going their way and they don't have the backup plan they thought they did. "You'd have influence," he tried, his tone softer now. "You could shape the direction we take." "This isn't..." I cut him off gently. "It's exactly what it looks like. You saw me talking to Briggs, and now you want to make sure those conversations don't happen again." But here's the thing, Rick. They will. Whether I work for you or not. That last part hit him harder than the refusal itself, because it meant the game had shifted out of his control. For a second, I saw something human cross his face. Not anger. Not even embarrassment. More like the sting of realizing the rules he'd played by for years weren't written in ink anymore. I picked the cloth back up and went back to wiping the counter. "You'll find someone else," I said lightly, like we were discussing who'd bake pies for the church fundraiser. "Someone who wants the job for the title, not the leash." He lingered another few seconds, as if there was still one more argument he could make if he just found the right angle. But the thing about moments like this, in kitchens, in boardrooms, at summer picnics when the last hot dog is gone, is that you can feel when the decision's already been made. When he finally turned and walked out, the click of his shoes on the tile sounded sharper than when he came in. I stood there a moment longer, listening to the rain. Opportunities were like weather in Willow Creek. They moved fast, and everyone noticed when a storm was coming. Rick could try to close his doors, but the truth was, the air had already changed, and I had no intention of stepping back inside his walls. It was just after lunch on a Tuesday when the sound of tires crunching over the long gravel driveway broke the quiet. From the kitchen window, I could see them, 2 sleek black SUVs pulling up like something out of a political campaign stop. The kind of vehicles that didn't usually come this deep into Willow Creek unless there was a ribbon cutting or a photo op. Rick was in his office, probably assuming whoever it was had come for him. And in a way, they had. The first SUV door opened, and out stepped Matthew Briggs, calm, tailored, looking like the man who knew every vote at a zoning board meeting before the meeting even started. But it was the second figure that made me pause. Sophie Klein. Even from a distance, you could tell she wasn't from around here. San Francisco sharp, navy silk blouse, perfectly tailored trousers, sunglasses that probably cost more than my month's rent when I lived in Chicago. She was a name I knew from the business pages, a tech investor who'd made her fortune early and then started quietly funding projects that actually mattered. Clean water systems, affordable solar grids, and, according to a recent profile, a string of sustainable housing developments in mid-sized towns. I was halfway down the hall when I heard the front door open. Rick's voice came first, all charm and volume. "Matthew! Sophie! What a surprise!" And then Briggs cut in, not unkindly, but with a firmness that could level a conversation. "We're actually here to see Claire." There was a beat of silence you could have bottled. When I stepped into the foyer, Sophie Klein turned toward me like she'd been expecting me. "We're building a development fund focused on sustainable housing," she said. "No small talk, just right to the point. We need someone with vision and the grit to get it done. You have both." I didn't ask how she knew. People like Sophie didn't fly across the country on a hunch. She named a figure. $500,000 a year, plus equity. The words were clean, factual, but I still felt them land like a small earthquake in the middle of the room. Rick's expression didn't change much on the surface, but I've lived in small towns long enough to recognize the signs. The faint tightening around the eyes, the half second where he forgot to breathe, the way his jaw set just a little harder. That number wasn't just a salary. It was a statement that the woman dusting his piano last week was worth more to someone else than most of his annual development deals. I glanced toward him, not to provoke, but to read the room. "Thank you," I told Sophie, keeping my tone even, "but I need a few days to think." Her smile didn't waver. "Take the time you need, but we'd like to move quickly." That's the thing about people like Sophie. They understand momentum. In a town like Willow Creek, you can lose a deal before you've even made it if the wrong whisper gets to the wrong person. She was making it clear this wasn't just an opportunity. It was a clock ticking. Briggs shook my hand on the way out, warm and steady, and Sophie gave me her card. Thick, unglossed stock, the kind that said she didn't need to dress it up for you to take it seriously. The SUVs pulled away, their taillights disappearing down the drive. I could feel Rick's eyes on me even before I turned back toward the hall. He was standing there, hands shoved in his pockets, trying to look casual but failing. He didn't say a word, but he didn't have to, because we both knew what had just happened. This wasn't about losing me to another job. It was about losing me to a stage he couldn't get to, a place where the deals were bigger, the players sharper, and the stakes higher than anything Willow Creek could offer. And for the first time since I'd walked into his kitchen with a dust cloth in my hand, I think he realized he might be the one who'd been working for me all along. The rain had eased by the time evening settled over Willow Creek. The estate smelled faintly of wet cedar and the lingering scent of catered canapés from the gala that had been reheated for lunch. I'd tucked myself away in the library, stacking the oversized architecture books back onto the mahogany shelves. It was the one room in the Callahan house where you could hear the tick of the clock over the hum of the HVAC. A small reminder that time moved the same whether you were hosting senators or just cleaning up after them. The last book was halfway back on the shelf when I heard the door open behind me. I didn't have to turn to know it was Rick. His footsteps had a certain rhythm, confident but just slow enough to suggest he was arranging his words as he walked. He closed the door, something he rarely did unless the conversation was meant to stay private. Jacket draped over his arm. Tie loosened, the faint fatigue in his shoulders told me his day hadn't gone to plan. "Give me 1 week," he said, skipping any pleasantries. I turned slowly, eyebrow raised. 1 week for what? 1 week to show you I can value you for your skills, not your history, he said. His tone carried no smirk, no smugness, just a steady undercurrent that was part plea, part challenge. Work with me as an equal. If I can't prove myself, you walk. It wasn't the kind of offer you hear in the kitchen while someone's passing you a grocery list. This was a proposal meant to rewrite the way we dealt with each other. I let the silence stretch, not for drama, but because I wanted to read him the way folks in town read a zoning board, looking for the tells before they cast their vote. No cleaning, I said finally. Of course not. No errands. He hesitated, barely, but I caught it. No errands. And no helping out when you're short-staffed, I added. Just consulting. Agreed. His eyes stayed on mine, and for once, I didn't feel like he was trying to win the moment. He was trying to keep it. Why now? I asked. He shifted, glancing toward the tall window where the rain had left streaks down the glass. Because I don't want to be the man who let you walk away without ever knowing what it would be like to work with you instead of around you. In a place like Willow Creek, that was as close as you got to an apology in public life. I'd heard the same tone from the mayor once, after the town budget meeting, when the school bond almost collapsed. I extended my hand. He took it. Not the distracted half shake he gave at country club luncheons, but a solid, deliberate clasp. The kind you feel in your shoulder. The kind that meant you couldn't take it back without everyone knowing you broke your word. It struck me, in that moment, that this was our first real handshake. Every interaction before had been layered with roles we never questioned. Employer and house staff, benefactor and helper, man in charge and woman behind the scenes. This was the first time the ground felt level. In Willow Creek, deals like this didn't need contracts to be binding. They were sealed over pie at the diner, at the end of a church committee meeting, or apparently in a paneled library with a clock ticking in the corner. As I let go of his hand, the weight of the week ahead settled in. It wasn't just a test for him. It was a test for me, to see if I could trust a man who had underestimated me for years to actually let me steer, even for 7 days. Somewhere down the hall, the grandfather clock struck 8. By the time it chimed again next week, we'd know whether this was the start of something different or the cleanest ending either of us could hope for. And just in case it wasn't, Sophie Klein's card still sat in the inside pocket of my jacket. By Monday at 8 a.m., the Callahan Properties conference room felt more like neutral ground than enemy territory. The long oak table gleamed, a fresh carafe of coffee sat steaming at the far end, and the blinds were drawn halfway to block the glare from the rising sun over Willow Lake. I'd arrived early, not out of nerves, but because I knew Rick wouldn't. Old habit, let him walk into the room I'd already claimed. I sat at the head of the table, a neat stack of reports in front of me. My pen rested just so on the top folder, angled as if I'd been mid-note when someone walked in. I wanted him to see the picture before he even heard the words. Rick came in at 8:05, holding a mug of coffee he'd clearly poured himself from the machine in the kitchenette. Not the catered cappuccinos he liked to order when clients were coming. Just plain, black coffee in one of those corporate mugs that still had last year's logo. He lingered by the counter like a man deciding whether to hover or to pretend he had something else to do. "Morning," I said. "No, Mr. Callahan. Not anymore." He nodded, pulled out the chair halfway down the table. "Your company's been flat for 3 years," I began, no preamble. The sentence landed like a gavel. Your competitors are eating your market share, and you're still using strategies from 2015. The bristle was instant, not visible to an untrained eye, but I'd sat through enough small-town council meetings to recognize the subtle tightening of someone's jaw when they're about to defend a bad decision. Before he could speak, I kept going. You're focused on high-end developments in saturated markets, while mid-sized cities, the ones just outside major hubs, are begging for investment. And every day, you wait. Someone else moves in. His brow furrowed. We've built our brand on an audience that's aging out, I said, sliding the first report toward him. This, I tapped the paper, is a plan to diversify into eco-friendly developments, solar integration, recycled materials, community gardens. Not just because it's the right thing to do, but because the market is shifting and you're standing still. The silence after that was the kind you get at a church potluck when someone suggests replacing the fried chicken with a vegan spread. Shock, confusion, and a pinch of offense, all rolled into one. I leaned in slightly. If you want the numbers, I've got them. Projected growth in green certified properties is up 32% over the past 5 years. City councils in towns you've never even visited are offering tax incentives for exactly this kind of build. But if you're not in, You'll be irrelevant in 5 years. Rick's fingers tapped the edge of the report, a slow, thoughtful rhythm. He didn't argue. That was new. I studied him the way you do at a company picnic when the guy who's always running the grill suddenly lets someone else flip the burgers. Curiosity mixed with a quiet suspicion that he's about to hand over more control than he realizes. "This is bold," he said finally. "No," I corrected gently. "It's necessary." Bold would have been doing this 5 years ago. His gaze met mine across the table. For a second, there was no boss and no employee, just two people staring down the same problem from different angles. Outside, I could hear the faint thud of delivery trucks backing into the loading dock, the Monday morning supply run for the properties under renovation. Life in the building went on, unaware that the direction of the whole company was tilting in a new way. He flipped through the proposal slowly, not rushing the process, not deflecting. I knew enough about men like Rick to recognize that this wasn't surrender, it was calculation. The gears were turning, weighing risk against image, profit against the cost of being wrong. "This is a lot to take in," he said finally. I smiled. "That's why you have me here. 1 week, remember?" The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. If this had been a PTA meeting or a town budget session, this was the part where everyone in the room realizes the vote might not go the way they expected, but they're too proud to leave early. He set the report down. "All right, let's see where this goes." It wasn't a ringing endorsement, but it was more than I'd gotten in 3 years. And in Willow Creek, sometimes the smallest shift was the one that started the landslide. By Wednesday morning, the conference room had been turned into a miniature command center. 3 laptops lined the table, each with a different backdrop queued up. The glass skyline of Austin, the greenbelt neighborhoods of Raleigh, and a set of converted warehouses in Denver that now housed tech startups and microbreweries. The blinds were pulled halfway, letting in just enough winter sunlight to keep the room from feeling like a bunker. Claire moved between screens with an ease that made it hard to believe she'd ever been cleaning baseboards in this same building. She didn't just know the data. She wore it, like a second skin. Market projections flowed into zoning board politics. Statistics softened into stories about families in need of affordable housing. And every pivot in the conversation landed exactly where she wanted it to. On the first call, a young developer from Austin grinned when Claire referenced the city's missing middle housing gap. "You've done your homework," he said, leaning closer to his camera. Claire only smiled. "I used to build in markets like yours. You can either keep playing catch-up to the big players, or you can build something they can't afford to ignore." Rick sat off to the side, coffee in hand, mostly silent. It wasn't that he didn't have questions. It was that every time he started to open his mouth, Claire would drop a line that hooked the room so tightly there was nothing left for him to add. By the second call, Denver, Rick wasn't thinking about his own talking points anymore. He was watching the way people responded to her. These were seasoned developers, not small-town council members. Yet when Claire spoke, their posture changed. They leaned forward, smiled more, interrupted less. She didn't dominate the conversation with volume or ego. She guided it the way a skilled conductor guides a symphony, not with force, but with precision and presence. Between calls, Claire sipped from her plain ceramic mug and adjusted her notes. No small talk, no filler. When Rick mentioned that the Denver contact had been on the fence for months, she simply said, "They won't be after today," and moved on. The Raleigh call was the one Rick expected to go sideways. That team had a reputation for being skeptical of outside consultants, and their city council was notorious for dragging negotiations out over multiple budget cycles. But Claire opened with a story about a community garden she'd helped fund in a different city. Not because it was on the agenda, but because she knew one of Raleigh's council members volunteered at a similar garden. By the end of the call, they weren't talking about if they'd work together. They were talking about when. Rick leaned back in his chair, feeling the faint, disorienting shift of perspective that comes when you realize you've been defining success all wrong. He'd always thought power came from being the loudest voice in the room, the one holding the pen over the contract. But watching Claire, he saw something else, the quiet pull of someone people trusted without needing to be convinced. That night, the office was quiet except for the hum of the heating system kicking on. Rick stood in the doorway of Claire's temporary workspace, leaning against the frame like he wasn't sure if he was interrupting. "I thought power was about control," he said finally. Claire didn't look up right away, finishing a note in the margin of a market report before setting her pen down. "And now?" He stepped into the room, hands in his pockets. "Now I think the way you work, it's about trust." She gave the faintest smile, the kind that carried both acknowledgement and a touch of history. "Control builds empires," she said. "Trust keeps them standing." It wasn't meant as a jab, but Rick felt the truth of it like a pebble in his shoe. Small, but impossible to ignore. In Willow Creek, word was already trickling out. Not about the calls themselves, but about the shift. People noticed when Rick Callahan didn't take center stage in his own building. They noticed when a woman who used to buy coffee at the gas station before work was now getting deliveries from the bakery downtown. A just because gesture from one of the town's more influential families who'd heard she was back in the game. By the time Claire shut down her laptop, Rick knew two things. The deals she just set in motion would change the trajectory of his company, and none of them would have happened without her. And for the first time, he wondered if he was the one being tested. By Friday morning, the stack of papers Claire carried into Rick's office wasn't just a proposal, it was a roadmap. 42 pages, tabbed and color-coded, each section tied to numbers, timelines, and the kind of market insight you couldn't buy from a consultant who'd never left their desk. She set it down on his desk without ceremony. Restructuring departments to cut redundancy. Reallocating stagnant capital into growth-ready sectors. Launching a pilot project in 3 cities, Austin, Raleigh, and Des Moines, to prove the model works before scaling. Rick glanced at the tabs, his brow lifting slightly at the level of detail. "With this," she said, her voice even, but carrying that undercurrent of certainty, "you could triple revenue in 2 years. But more importantly," she paused just long enough for him to look up, "you could actually make a dent in affordable housing shortages." The words hung in the air like the last chord of a church hymn, resonant, unhurried, impossible to pretend you hadn't heard. Rick leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. It wasn't that he doubted her math. It was that he could already feel the weight of what she was asking him to step into. Projects like this changed more than profit margins. They shifted reputations, political alliances, even the pecking order in a place like Willow Creek. He flipped to the section on the pilot cities. She'd anticipated local resistance, zoning obstacles, supply chain hiccups, and she'd countered each with practical solutions, not just glossy optimism. When he finally closed the folder, he did it slowly, as though making sure he was ready for whatever came out of his mouth next. "Be my partner." Claire raised an eyebrow, one corner of her mouth curving in the faintest smile. "Equal partner." His nod was cautious. "Equal partner." And, she added, sliding the folder a little closer to him, "profit split. 10% of all projects to community initiatives. Housing trusts, job training programs, the kind of things that keep the developments from turning into just another way to make the rich richer." For a moment, his jaw worked like he was weighing whether to push back. 10% was a lot in this world. Enough to draw questions from his board, maybe even a few thinly veiled lectures at the country club. But in the end, he only said deal. They stood. And when they shook hands this time, there was no trace of the old imbalance, no unspoken "I'm letting you in" or the "slim. You're lucky to be here." It was mutual. Respect had replaced tolerance. Out in the hallway, the low hum of office chatter carried on. A junior analyst walked by, giving them both a curious glance. Word had already gotten around that something was shifting in the top floor offices. The rumor mill in Willow Creek spun faster than the pie wheel at the Rotary Club picnic. Rick caught himself wondering what people would say at the next Chamber of Commerce luncheon. Half the room would call it a bold, forward-thinking move. The other half would whisper about how the man who never shared control had just given half the reins to the woman who used to sweep the entryway. But as they stood there, sealing the agreement with nothing more than a handshake, Rick realized he didn't care which half spoke louder. Because for the first time in years, the future didn't feel like something he was chasing. It felt like something he was building, with someone who knew how to make sure it stood. And somewhere deep down, Claire knew this was more than just a business deal. It was a signal to Rick, to the town, maybe even to herself, that the woman in the apron had never been invisible. She'd just been waiting for the right moment to step back into the light. 6 months can pass quickly in business, but in Willow Creek, it's enough time for the whole town to rewrite its opinion of you. Twice. By the time spring rolled around, Callahan Donovan Development wasn't just a name on the glass doors of the downtown office building. It was on local news stations, in trade magazines, and even in the speeches of a few governors eager to claim credit for innovative housing initiatives. They had projects in 5 states now, each one with a slightly different blueprint, but the same core idea: build smart, build green, and make sure people who worked in a community could actually afford to live there. On a warm Saturday morning in late April, the mayor stood at a makeshift podium in front of a brand new 120-unit affordable housing complex. The brickwork was clean, the balconies faced the morning sun, and the landscaping was still dotted with tags on the young trees. The ribbon stretched across the entryway in a bold sweep of red, fluttering a little in the breeze. Claire stood to the left of Rick, the mayor to her right, and half the city council fanned out behind them. On the sidewalk, a cluster of local kids darted between folding chairs while their parents chatted, eyeing the open doors that led to the community garden and the on-site daycare. The place didn't look like affordable housing in the way people said it with that pinched expression at town meetings. It looked like somewhere you'd be proud to bring your friends home to. The mayor gave the usual remarks about public-private partnerships, economic growth, and the bright future of our community. Local news crews caught every handshake, every flash of the giant scissors they handed to Claire when it was time to cut the ribbon. The moment the blades sliced clean through, the crowd broke into applause, and Claire felt a strange, quiet satisfaction settle over her. She'd been on stages before, charity galas, business summits, fashion industry events, but this was different. Those had been about image. This was about impact. You could stand here, look at the building, and know exactly who it was for. Rick leaned in slightly as they posed for photos, his voice pitched low enough so only she could hear. You've changed the way I see everything. Not just business. People. People. Claire didn't answer right away. She let the words sit there between them, the same way you let a fine wine breathe before you take the first sip. There had been a time when she wouldn't have believed him, when she'd have thought it was just another line, a way to smooth over the past. But 6 months of watching him take calls from housing advocates, sit through planning sessions without checking his watch, and insist on visiting build sites himself had worn down her skepticism. Still, she knew better than to get sentimental in front of cameras. It's not me, she said, keeping her eyes on the crowd. It's what happens when you decide the story isn't just about you anymore. Behind them, the city council members were already talking about the next project, swapping rumors about state funding like they were trading recipes at a church potluck. Somewhere in the back, an old family friend from Claire's Donovan apparel days caught her eye and mouthed proud of you. After the speeches wrapped up, the real event began, walking through the complex with future tenants. Claire stopped to talk with a woman in scrubs who'd been on a waiting list for 2 years. I work at the hospital, but I couldn't afford a place close enough to walk, she said. Now I can. That means more time with my kids. Rick listened, hands in his pockets, a faintly thoughtful look on his face. 6 months ago, he might have nodded politely and moved on. Today, he asked follow-up questions about her commute, the daycare, whether the parking felt safe after dark. Local business owners hovered near the edge of the group, some already eyeing opportunities. In a town like Willow Creek, the ripples from a single project could turn into waves. More foot traffic for Main Street shops, more customers for the diner, maybe even a push for the city council to approve that long-delayed park renovation. By the time the event wound down, the news vans had packed up, the scissors were back in their velvet-lined box, and the mayor had slipped away for another ribbon cutting across town. But Claire lingered a little longer, watching the first few families carry boxes into their new apartments. In the parking lot, Rick paused before getting into his car. You know, he said, 6 months ago, I thought giving up control was the same as giving up success. I was wrong. Claire smiled faintly. I know. And as they drove off in separate directions, the new sign on the building caught the light. Willow Creek Commons, a Callahan Donovan development. The name was permanent now, carved in steel and set in stone, just like the change it represented. That winter, Willow Creek's air carried the smell of wood smoke and cinnamon from the bakery downtown. The streets were strung with Christmas lights, every lamppost wrapped in garland, the kind of picture postcard charm you'd expect from a town where everyone still shows up for the tree lighting. In the weeks leading up to the Chamber of Commerce's annual banquet, people whispered about who might win Leader of the Year. The award wasn't just a plaque. In a place like Willow Creek, it was a declaration of who the town trusted to shape its future. When the announcement came, the local paper ran it above the fold. Claire Donovan, named Leader of the Year. The headline sat right next to an ad for the grocery store's Christmas ham sale, but nobody missed the point. The ceremony was held in Willow Creek's historic town hall, the old brick building with the clock tower and worn marble steps. Claire hadn't walked through those doors since Donovan Apparel's launch party years ago. Back then, she'd been in a gold silk dress, shaking hands with city council members, pitching her vision for a fashion brand with small-town roots and big city reach. The applause that night had felt like a promise. Now, as she climbed those same steps, she wore a navy wool dress, simple pearl earrings, and a confidence earned the hard way. The crowd inside was a blend of familiar faces: business owners, pastors, the high school principal, and a few city council members who had once avoided making eye contact with her in the grocery store aisle. At the front table, Rick sat in his tuxedo, grinning like he already knew what she was going to say. When the chamber president called her name, the applause rolled through the room like a warm tide. Claire walked to the podium, pausing just a moment to take it all in. The polished wood, the smell of coffee from the urn in the corner, the faint creak of chairs as people shifted to face her. She began, her voice steady but warm. 3 years ago, I was cleaning houses, including the one belonging to the man sitting right there. She tipped her head toward Rick, who raised his hand in mock surrender, drawing a ripple of laughter. I thought my story was over, she continued. I thought the chapter on who I was, on what I could do, had been closed for good. Her eyes swept the room, catching the gaze of a young woman at the back who'd just opened a bakery with a microloan from the housing complex's community fund. Claire smiled at her before going on. But worth, she said, her tone tightening with conviction, isn't measured by what you own. It's proven by what you do when you have nothing. And when you use success to lift others, you don't just rise alone, you bring a community with you. For a second, there was silence. Not awkward silence. Listening silence. The kind that wraps around a room when people realize the person speaking isn't just giving a speech. They're giving a truth you can feel in your chest. Claire thought of the first time she'd walked into Rick's house with a mop bucket in hand, how small she'd felt in that cavernous kitchen. She thought of Evelyn Harper's sewing room, the midnight blue gown, the gala, and the look on Rick's face when he finally understood who she was. And more importantly, who she'd always been. The silence broke with the sound of chairs scraping back. One by one, people rose to their feet. The ovation wasn't polite. It was the kind that makes you believe in second chances. Rick stood too, clapping harder than most, and for once, he wasn't trying to be the center of attention. He was just part of the crowd, part of the community she'd helped rebuild. As the applause swelled, Claire's eyes found Matthew Briggs near the side wall, smiling in quiet approval. And then Sophie Klein, arms crossed, giving her a small nod, the kind that said, "Told you so." When the noise finally eased, Claire stepped down from the podium. The mayor caught her hand, squeezing it as he leaned in. "You've done more in 3 years than some of us manage in a lifetime," he said. But as she made her way back to her seat, Claire didn't feel like the story was over. If anything, it felt like she was just getting to the good part. The room was still buzzing from the ovation when the line to shake Claire's hand began to form. Some came with polite congratulations, others with real gratitude, but most with that curious half smile, the look of someone who just realized they'd underestimated her all this time. Near the back of the line stood a young woman in a simple black dress, fidgeting with the strap of her handbag. She waited until most of the crowd had thinned before stepping forward. Her voice was quiet but steady. "Ms. Donovan," she said, "I lost my family's business last year. My dad passed, and we couldn't keep the hardware store going. I'm working at the diner now, just trying to get by. Your speech, it gives me hope I can start over." Something about the way she said "start over" tugged at Claire. It wasn't desperation. It was that fragile, stubborn spark that refuses to go out, even when the wind's been against you for too long. Claire reached into her bag without breaking eye contact, pulled out a business card, and pressed it into the young woman's hand. "Come see me Monday," she said. "We'll talk." The girl's eyes widened. Really? Really? She left looking lighter than when she'd walked in, clutching the card like it was a ticket to someplace she'd almost stopped believing existed. Claire was still watching her go when Rick appeared at her side, standing just inside the doorway. He followed her gaze toward the young woman disappearing down the marble steps. "That was you, wasn't it?" he asked quietly. "A few years ago." Claire's answer was a simple nod. "And now it's her turn," she said. They stepped out into the crisp winter night. The December air carried the faint scent of pine from the wreaths hung along Main Street. Across the lake, Willow Creek's Christmas lights shimmered on the water, breaking into ripples with the wind. Rick stuffed his hands into his coat pockets as they walked toward the sidewalk. "You ever think about how one dinner invitation changed everything?" he asked. Claire gave a soft laugh, the kind that comes from knowing the truth isn't as simple as people think. "It didn't change me, Rick. It reminded me who I've been all along." They walked in companionable silence for a few steps, the sound of their shoes crunching against the salted sidewalk. The holiday bustle was winding down. The last few diners were trickling out of the Italian place on the corner. A couple of teenagers were sipping hot chocolate outside the coffee shop, and in the distance, the church bells began to chime the hour. For the first time in a long time, Claire wasn't thinking about what she'd lost or what she still had to prove. She was thinking about Monday morning, about sitting down with that young woman and showing her the first steps out of the hole she was in. She was thinking about the chain reaction that could follow, how one life turning a corner can quietly shift a whole block, a whole neighborhood. Rick broke the silence again, his tone softer than usual. "You know, I thought partnership meant sharing the work. Turns out it also means sharing the wins and the responsibility." Claire glanced at him. "And the credit," she added, with a faint smirk. "Yeah," he said. "That too." They reached the edge of the square, where the street lamps cast a warm glow on the brick pavement. Ahead of them, the lake's surface shimmered, reflecting both the Christmas lights and the moon above. It struck Claire that this was the first time she and Rick had stood side by side in public, without any pretense, no hidden agendas, no silent tests, no one keeping score. Just two people who'd learned, sometimes the hard way, that using what you have to lift someone else doesn't make you smaller. It makes the whole table bigger. She pulled her coat tighter against the cold and looked out at the water. "You know what I've learned, Rick?" "What's that?" "That the real turning points don't happen at the big events. Not the galas, not the ribbon cuttings, not even awards night. They happen when nobody's watching, when you slide a business card across the table to someone who's been told no too many times." Rick was quiet for a moment, as if committing that to memory. They started walking again, their footsteps in sync now, heading toward the parking lot. The night air was sharp, but neither seemed in a hurry to get inside. Somewhere behind them, the lights of the town hall flickered off, and the square settled into that late-night stillness unique to small towns in winter. Peaceful, but full of untold stories. And as they disappeared into the dark, they weren't just business partners or friends who'd been through a strange and winding journey together. They were keepers of something bigger. The understanding that every life you help pull forward has a way of pulling the next one and the next. The lake shimmered once more in the distance, and the town they both called home kept on quietly breathing, ready for whatever came next.